Hello, I'm Erin-Chapman, and this is my Module 6 case study for educational leadership. Section 1, summarizing the case. This is about James, who is a 15-year-old large-billed student with a history of trouble and behavior issues, threatening David, a 13-year-old slight-billed honor student with no prior issues at school or at home, to hold a pair of brass knuckles for him. When both boys are brought into assistant principal Richard Inman's office, he also brings in a police officer, the school police officer, and David was nervous and shaking and crying. So the police officer did a search on him, which I think is very questionable. That's the first thing that I was like, And once the search was done, they found brass knuckles, which is a prohibited weapon and constitutes a felony. So the police officer arrested David. At this time, James jumps up and says, "Hey, those are my brass knuckles. I made him hold them. I threatened him to do it so I could use them after school." Instead of letting David go, the police officer arrested both of them and charged them both with the felony for the prohibited weapon. James has a history of these kinds of things, and the school has a zero tolerance policy. So that means that along with the felony charges, both students would have to be expelled for at least 45 days and go to the district's disciplinary alternative education program, which I'm going to call DAEP from the rest of the time. James had been there before, but this could really ruin David's future since he's an honor student. Richard wrote up the paperwork with no problem for James since he instigated the situation, but when it came to writing up David's, he really didn't feel right about it. His moral compass was saying, no, he shouldn't do this and be charged like he brought the weapon since he was threatened. So he tore up the papers. He said, I'm not going to do it. About a week later, the director of secondary education messaged him and said, hey, you need to do this and write up David, or you're going to receive an official reprimand. This can be included on your personnel file. So, the legal and ethical issues. The legal issues were David and James were in possession of a prohibited weapon and therefore charged with a felony offense. Another one is the school has a zero tolerance policy that states students that get these kinds of offenses will be expelled for at least 45 days into the DAEP program. So I feel there's a lot of ethical issues going on here. Firstly, David is going to be railroaded into going to the DAEP and having a felony because he was intimidated by another student to hold a weapon. The charges are being brought up on him like he brought it into school and wasn't threatened to hold it. Also, David going to DAEP for at least 45 days is going to derail his hopes, dreams, potential, and future. And then if Richard goes against his moral compass, he's going to get written up by the director of secondary education, and that's going to follow him. So I think there's a lot of ethical issues that go along with this case. So, what happened was Assistant Principal Richard Inman must make the decision between filing paperwork to expel David, who is threatened into holding a weapon, or receive an official reprimand from the district for violating school policy. So that's really our ethical issue right now. All right, so the relevant facts, the people. We have Richard Inman, which is the assistant principal, first year, born and raised in the South Side. James, a 15-year-old large-billed leader of a group, or gang, if you will, who has a history of violence. David, who's 13 years old, slight-billed honor band student, never been in trouble at home or at school. We have the school police officer who did that questionable search on David and found the brass knuckles and arrested both the boys. We have James's mother, who when told what happened with her student, her son, said, just let him sit in there for a few days, maybe he'll learn his lesson, which gives a little insight to his home life, I think. David's mother, who was absolutely devastated that this happened, angry, and questioned Richard about why he did not protect her son. And then the director of secondary education, who knows all the facts but still wants David to be written up and sent to DAEP. So more of a follow the policies before student kind of guy. Places. So the places are Rocket Junior High School hallways, and that's where the teacher witnessed the exchange between James and David. Richard Inman's office, where David and James were questioned, the brass knuckles were found, both boys were arrested, and also where the director of secondary education told Richard to follow through with the expulsion. And then the juvenile detention center, where the police officer took both James and David. So the program, Rocket Junior High School, it is a public school since it's in that south side. It's not a charter or a private school. So students 13 through 15 attend special education through honors classes. General education classes are where James would attend. And honors classes is where David attended. The DAEP, or the Disciplinary Alternative Education Program, was described as a hellhole that students had to go to that violate this zero tolerance policy of the district. All right, so let's prioritize this information. There are really three things we have to think about when we're making our decisions. One, David was intimidated to hold the weapon by another student that was not only larger than him, but also known for violence. Two, if Richard follows through with David's expulsion to DAEP, David's dreams and future could be ruined. And four, Richard will receive an official reprimand that will be in his personnel record if he doesn't follow through with the expulsion to DAEP for David. All right, so here are the options. I think there are three options. Number one, Richard could not follow through with filing David's expulsion paperwork and just take the reprimand. Number two, Richard could follow through with the filing of the expulsion paperwork and send David to DAEP for at least 45 days. Or three, Richard could go argue David's case at the school board and the director of secondary education to try to change their mind about the situation. Okay, pros and cons. The number one, where he decides to not file the paperwork and just receive the reprimand. Pro, David could not have to go to DAEP, and Richard will have made his ethics known to the school district and shown he will stand by these ethics even if it means getting reprimanded. Cons, Richard will get reprimanded, which could hurt his career, and the director of secondary education could still send David to DAEP. Okay, number two, Richard could follow through and just send David to DAEP. Pros, Richard's not going to get a reprimand. He's going to be fine and just go on with his day. Cons, David would go to DAEP for at least 45 days, which could ruin his dreams and future. And number three, Richard could go argue David's case to superintendent and director of secondary education and try to change their minds. Pros, the superintendent or director of secondary education could change their mind about Richard having to file the papers on David. This could also show them that Richard will stand by his moral compass and fight for what he thinks is right. Cons, superintendent and director of secondary education could see this as insubordination and it could really hurt Richard's career, and they could still send David to DAEP. All right, the option I chose that I think is going to be the best is number one. Richard will not follow through with filing the paperwork and just take the official reprimand. I chose this because Richard feels very strongly that David should not go to the DAEP, and he was railroaded into this, and it's going to ruin the kid's future. Two, David may still even be sent to DAEP if he does this, but Richard would have no part in that action and could support David when he returned back to class. Richard would get the official reprimand, but in the future, his school district would know he stands behind his moral compass and his set of ethics. And when Richard leaves the district, which I would if I were him, he can explain why he was reprimanded to any future employer, and many could see Richard putting the student first as a positive instead of a negative. Implementing this decision, Richard would need to notify the director of secondary education he would not follow through with the paperwork, and that he does understand that this means he's getting a reprimand. If the director of secondary education still files the paperwork and sends David to DAEP, Richard would be able to help support him and his family in any appeals that are filed against this decision. Number three, the district could use Richard's refusal to file paperwork on David as an insubordination and not renew his contract the following year. If this happens, many districts are going to see Richard's actions as putting David's best interest before a broken policy. And on the chance that Richard continues to work for the school district, he should push the school board to change the broken policy so other students won't be caught up in this unfair situation like David was. All right, so our NELP standard. This just says that we need to be able to take what we learned and all the skills and information we use to be able to make these professional standards and cultivate professional norms. This whole class has really stretched me as an educator and as an educational leader to think outside the box and not just get caught up in my emotions. First time I read this case study, I was like, oh no, this is totally unfair. There's no way. I'd go storming into the office. And then once I went through everything else we talked about and learned about, I said, okay, let's keep a level head and let's really look at the situation and all the options to see what would work best, and puts the student first, even if it does mean our job or a reprimand. I really enjoyed this class. Thank you so much for everything you've done, and have a great end of semester. Thank you.